Infinite spiritual power, scattered skills, I am invincible. Sorry, you are unable to learn advanced skills. Hey. Keywords of the novel. My Spiritual Power Max. No pop-ups. Download the complete collection of My Spiritual Power MAX TXT. Read the latest chapters of My Spiritual Power Max, Chapter 1. Spiritual Awakening. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Spiritual Awakening. The north wind is howling, and the vast snowfall blends heaven and earth, blocking all vitality. But it is in this cold winter day that Lyoto City is decorated with lights and colorful decorations everywhere, and the streets and alleys are filled with a festive atmosphere. Today is New Year's Day. In addition to celebrating the beginning of the new year, it is also a significant day for families with children who have just turned 6 years old. That is spiritual awakening. The awakening of spiritual roots is the most important ritual in life for people on the Kaiyang continent, and it is also the crucial first step to truly enter this world. On the Kaiyang continent, everyone has a spiritual root, and the attributes of the spiritual root will represent whether a person is suitable for cultivation. Those who practice on the Kaiyang road have extremely high rights and honors. Regardless of your current status, as long as your spiritual roots are excellent enough, even the children of prisoners of death can help their elders overcome difficulties and allow their families to enjoy glory. There is an imperial temple in the east of Lyoto City to commemorate the legendary Kaiyang Emperor's temple. Although the incense is also good on weekdays, scenes like this one that are blocked early in the morning only occur once a year. Today, this is the venue responsible for the annual spiritual awakening. All children in the family who have reached the age of 6 are mobilized to gather around the families, hope and pray for a bright future. The sun rose above my head, and the gate of the Emperor Temple slowly opened to both sides. However, I didn't expect that the people who had been waiting for a long time did not rush in, but instead lined up and walked inside in a neat and orderly manner. In fact, people have long been eager to rush in and grab a good position in their hearts, but they just want to think back. This is the place for the spiritual awakening ceremony. Who dares to make a mistake? Didn't you see that the Lord of Lyoto City is also honestly lining up behind? On Kaiyang Road, the organization responsible for awakening the spiritual roots is called Xianling Hall, and only the special secret techniques of Xianling Hall can awaken the spiritual roots. The person in charge of the awakening ceremony of Lyoto City in Xianling Hall is an elderly man who appears to be in his 80s. Despite his aging and frail appearance, he is an authentic spirit realm expert. As families entered one by one, various colors of light began to shine inside the Emperor Temple, and the spiritual root awakening ceremony began in an orderly manner. Initial spiritual power 37, fire attribute spiritual root, spiritual power purity, yellow, inferior, initial spiritual power 12, wood attribute spiritual root, spiritual power purity, yellow, inferior, initial spiritual power 31, metallic spiritual root, spiritual power purity, yellow, inferior. With the release of numbers, hopes also burst one by one. While those with excellent spiritual roots can turn over and shine in the light of the sect, those with poor spiritual roots can only choose the lives of ordinary people. Even for the descendants of some big families, they will face devastating blows, and their luxurious clothing and food will disappear in an instant. Someone who worries will naturally have someone who likes it. In the midst of sighs, a light suddenly rises and transforms into a small flying dragon with red and green wings hovering over a child's head. At the same time, the number 81 also appears on the child's arm. The old man in charge of the spiritual root awakening ceremony showed surprise on his face for the first time. He stood up suddenly, his voice trembling slightly with excitement. Qin Xiuwen, initial spiritual power is 81, with dual attributes of fire and wood spiritual roots, and contains the talent of the secondary divine beast flying dragon. Upon hearing this, everyone present exclaimed in surprise, even Qin Xiuwen's father, who had always been calm as a city lord, trembled with excitement. It's not surprising that everyone is like this. Qin Xiuwen's spiritual roots are really rare, with extremely high initial spiritual power. The fire would dual attribute spiritual roots, combined with the talent of the secondary divine beast flying dragon, are unparalleled. This type of spiritual root, Lyoto City, has not appeared for 100 years. The old man couldn't wait to finish reciting the last mnemonic. In the next moment, a deep red appeared above Qin Shouwen's head, like a sea of infernal fire, while the winged little flying dragon happily flapped its wings, swimming and playing in that sea of fire. Seeing this situation, the old man's pupils suddenly shrank. After taking a deep breath, he loudly said, Qin Shouwen, with an initial spiritual power of 81 and dual attributes of fire and wood, possesses the talent of a secondary divine beast, the flying dragon. His spiritual power is pure, red, and top-grade. The old man himself was in a spiritual realm, and this unreserved transmission spread throughout the entire Lyoto City in an instant. As a result, anyone who is currently in Lyoto City knows that a genius has emerged here. As Qin Shouwen's spiritual root attribute was revealed, everyone present turned their gaze to this gorgeous and chubby little boy. The boy's face was filled with joyful smiles, and his small hands were tightly clenched due to excitement. Not to mention being the only child, even Qin Lin, the father beside him, couldn't do a good job in facial expression management. Qin Lin's mouth was about to crack to the back of his ear, and he tried to suppress it to avoid losing his composure, otherwise he would have picked up his son and started cheering. Congratulations to the Lord of Qin City. Your Majesty, Tianzong, has achieved unlimited success and will become a saint in the future. This is truly a blessing for Lyoto City. With the first person at the beginning, more people quickly came forward to congratulate Qin Lin, and he didn't have the airs of a city lord. He bowed and thanked each other one by one. As the lord of the city, he is more worried than anyone about his son's spiritual roots not being excellent enough, because that would cause Qin Shouwen to lose the inheritance rights of the next lord. Fortunately, Qin Shouwen's excellence far exceeded his expectations. Not only did the big stone in his heart fall, but he was also eager to witness the rise of his son and the entire Qin family. After being happy as the focal point, Qin Shouwen turned to the next little boy who was about to awaken his spiritual roots. The boy's name is Ning Feng, who is thinner and younger than Qin Shouwen, and more than half a year younger than him. At this moment, he is timidly following his father. Qin Shouwen sneered at the expression on Ning Feng's face. He was well aware that this stinky little devil was a complete two-faced person, showing an honest and straightforward demeanor in front of adults. Without adults, he would be a small tyrant, and the two had formed many conflicts. In addition, what made Qin Shouwen even more angry was that although he was the son of the Lord of Lyoto City, the other party was also the child of the first pharmaceutical merchant in Lyoto City. His father often had to be scolded by his father even though he had suffered injustice for the development of Lyoto City. But today, Qin Shouwen finally had a chance to find the venue back. Seeing that Ning Feng was about to awaken his spiritual roots, Qin Shouwen said with a strange tone on the side. Ning Feng, dare you compare me to someone with higher spiritual power? If it were in the past, Qin Lin would have stopped his son long ago. How could he have been so provocative? But today Qin Lin was in a good mood, and Qin Shouwen's small indulgence was also due to him. Upon hearing this, Ning Feng looked at Qin Shouwen and then raised his head to look at his father who was by his side. Only then did he reluctantly say to Qin Shouwen, "My father taught me that a gentleman should not be too strong or aggressive. It's all the work of petty people." Qin Shouwen couldn't understand the meaning of Ning Feng's words, but instead thought that the other party was afraid of him and shouted even more loudly, "I see you're afraid. If you're afraid, you and your people will get out of the east of the city. That piece of land will belong to us from now on." After hearing this, Ning Feng let out a heavy sigh. He reached out and covered his chest, seemingly very sad, saying, "Brother Shouwen, Lyoto City is a common home for everyone, and it does not belong to any of us. Even if you are the future lord of the city, you cannot arbitrarily encircle the land and deprive us of the place to live. How different is this from bandits?" Qin Shouwen was taken aback by Ning Feng's words. The area east of the city he mentioned was naturally the place where these children played, and this was well known among them. Why did it become land occupation, deprivation, banditry, and so on to Ningfeng? What exactly does this mean? Qin Shiwen didn't turn a corner on his side, but his father Qin Lin couldn't bear to watch anymore. He pulled his son back to his side, so as not to make too many mistakes. The other party was a merchant's child, but his eloquence was not comparable to his own son. After pulling back his son, Qin Lin smiled and hugged Ning Yuze, the father of Ning Feng, but didn't say anything. After all, he was an adult, and his own child lost a fight. No matter how much he protected his offspring, he was too embarrassed to speak up. On the other hand, Ning Yuze also responded with an awkward smile and clenched his fists. The other party was the lord of the city, and Qin Shiwen's spiritual roots had already been revealed. His rise was inevitable, and he wanted to think about how to curry favor with the Qin family in the future. Ning Feng came to the old man because Qin Shiwen's stunning spiritual roots had greatly boosted his spirit. Seeing Ning Feng approaching, he took the initiative to pull up his hand, rolled up his sleeve, and used his fingers to dip into the nearby golden talisman to write 3 mysterious symbols on Ning Feng's arm. He then began reciting the spell of spiritual awakening. As the spell was finished, the first symbol gradually integrated into Ning Feng's arm. Ning Feng suddenly turned black in front of him, and then he entered a pale world where neither the sky nor the earth had any color. But Ning Feng didn't pay attention to all of this, because a towering giant tree had already caught all his eyes. This tree runs through heaven and earth, its height seems to have no end, with the sun and moon as its crown and the stars as its branches. Seeing this giant tree, Ning Feng remembered some knowledge his father had told him about spiritual roots. When the spiritual root awakens, everyone will see their own spiritual root, and the higher the initial spiritual power, the larger the spiritual root. I don't know if I'm big, but this is just an ordinary spiritual root. If it could turn into a little dragon like Qin Fatty's spiritual root, it would be so powerful. When Ning Feng complained that his spiritual roots were not enough to intimidate others, there was a commotion outside. A golden light shot out from Ning Feng's arm, transforming into an unnamed ancient tree standing on Ning Feng's arm. The size of the ancient tree far exceeded that of Qin Shiwen's flying dragon before. The old man in charge of awakening his spiritual roots originally thought that Qin Shiwen's spiritual roots were the most he had ever seen in his life, but at this moment, Ning Feng's spiritual roots had once again refreshed his understanding, especially the number faintly visible on Ning Feng's arm. Although it was a bit blurry, it looked like 100 no matter how it looked. The old man rubbed his eyes, and it looked like the number was still 100. He rubbed it again, although it was blurry, it was still 100. The old man didn't say a word during this process, but in reality, a huge wave surged in his heart. Initial spiritual power value. 100. How could it be? There has never been 100 before in history, and the size of this spiritual root is not right. Is it really 100? It's impossible, isn't it? Countless questions arose in the old man's heart. Although the number 100 doesn't sound much, only 19 points higher than Qin Shiwen, its meaning is different. 100 represents the ultimate initial spiritual power value, and most importantly, in the thousands of years of history of Kaiyang continent, the highest initial spiritual power during spiritual awakening was only 90.6. 100. The old man was about to announce, but suddenly stopped speaking because he dared not report this number. Not only did he doubt the authenticity of the number, but he was also afraid that if it were true, once the news spread, the entire Kaiyang continent would cause a storm. Although this spiritual root is very large and has a tree-shaped talent, the strongest spiritual root with a tree-shaped talent in history is 91. This matter still needs to be investigated. Let me first say 91. Anyway, this child is in Lyotu City. After I report this matter, those big shots should be interested and come to verify it within a month. After making a quick decision, the old man reached out and gently brushed Ning Feng's arm, covering the original number, 100, with the golden number, 91. Initial spiritual power, 91. Possesses tree-shaped talent. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Abandoned Spirit Root. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Abandoned Spirit Root. Initial Spiritual Power, 91. Possesses tree-shaped talent. After the old man finished speaking, Ning Feng's eyes had also returned to normal and he happened to hear what the other person was saying. 91. Ning Feng secretly glanced at Qin Shiwen, whose face looked a bit ugly. With a twist of his eyes, he put on a dull and uninteresting expression and said to his father standing beside him, still in a daze. Father, I have always been confused about what overestimating oneself means. Does it mean that a chubby little guy with only 81 initial spiritual powers insists on competing with a handsome guy with 91? When Ning Yuza heard that her son's initial spiritual power was as high as 91, her mind was completely confused. Looking at this value, the history of the entire Kaiyang continent will not exceed 100 people. At this moment, when Ning Feng suddenly asked, his head was still in a daze, so he unconsciously nodded. However, this scene made Qin Shiwen, who had finally understood, stomp his feet in anger. As for Qin Lin, he is a stunned Ning Feng. He is very grateful that he did not use his son's power to suppress others before, otherwise he would have become the eternal culprit of the Qin family. The old man in charge of awakening his spiritual roots took a deep breath. Fortunately, his over 100 years of experience had made him calm enough. If he were a restless young man, he might not be able to resist taking Ning Feng back to the Xian Spirit Hall. The old man suppressed the shock in his heart and continued to recite the spell, only to see the second rune slowly merge into Ning Feng's arm. Spirit Root Attribute. The old man was mentally prepared, waiting to report the amazing news again, but found that Ning Feng's spiritual roots had not changed at all. The old man was stunned by this scene. He quickly grabbed Ning Feng's arm and carefully scrutinized his revealed spiritual roots, wanting to see something. How could there be no attributes? Did I lose the rune water? The old man refused to believe that under such high initial spiritual power, the spiritual root had no attributes. He only believed that he was too excited and had encountered operational problems. He quickly dipped himself in rune water to supplement the rune and stared closely at it until it integrated into Ning Feng's arm. Unexpectedly, Ning Feng's spiritual roots remained unchanged as if joking with the old man. At this moment, even if the old man was calm, he felt a bit flustered and thought to himself, how could this be possible? According to the records of the Xianling Hall, only spiritual roots with spiritual power lower than 5 when awakened occasionally have no attributes. The old man was completely confused, just as he thought in his heart, the Kaiyang continent did not have a non-attribute spiritual root, but what happened were completely abandoned spiritual roots. The old man didn't want to believe it was true, so he once again extended his finger into the rune water. It wasn't until he tried many times that he had to accept this reality. The old man let out a sigh, filled with exhaustion and disappointment. Although he still couldn't accept it in his heart, he gritted his head and said, Soul Root Attributes. Attributes. None. As soon as this sentence was spoken, it was even more shocking than the initial spiritual power that had reached 91 before, and everyone's whispers and discussions suddenly came from around. Without attributes, isn't the spiritual root useless? Could it be a mistake? Isn't he the initial spiritual power 91? Can this also be invalidated? Ning Yuza's face had already changed greatly, and he could no longer care about etiquette. He quickly approached and requested, Master, please try again. Could something be wrong? The chaotic discussion gradually increased, and the old man snorted heavily upon seeing the situation. Then, the pressure of the imperial spirit realm suddenly dissipated. Under this pressure, those who were whispering felt weighed down by 1,000 pounds, and suddenly closed their mouths tightly, afraid to say another word. The chaos around returned to silence, while the last rune also merged into Ningfeng's arm. Ningfeng suddenly felt a buzzing sound in his head, and then he was trapped in a pile of ruins. Ningfeng was surrounded by corpses on the ground. Normally, a child who had just turned 6 would scream in shock when he saw this scene. However, at this moment, not only did he not scream, but he did not even see these ruins and corpses scattered everywhere in his eyes. There is only one book, one with unclear names and styles, but still has great appeal. Ningfeng couldn't help but reach out to touch it. Just as I came into contact with that book, it suddenly turned into a ferocious demon and rushed towards Ningfeng. Ningfeng was so frightened that his body trembled, and at this moment he found himself still in the Emperor Temple, while the old man responsible for awakening the spiritual roots was staring at his arm. Soon, the ancient tree on Ningfeng's arm finally changed. Seeing this scene, the old man breathed a sigh of relief and thought to himself that it was finally normal. But the old man never expected that his breath would get stuck in his throat before he could fully exhale. I saw a faint white halo on Ningfeng's spiritual roots, which looked incredibly holy. But every person present who saw this scene had a completely opposite expression to this sanctity. These people have twisted expressions, blushing all over their faces, appearing to be trying to endure, but they have already reached the critical point. This pain didn't last long, and soon the tranquility of the Emperor Temple was shattered by a burst of laughter. Qin Shiwen burst into laughter and shouted, "The purity of spiritual power is white. The worst quality. Ha ha ha, a waste that cannot be improved in a lifetime. Ningfeng's spiritual roots are useless. Qin Shiwen is right. When spiritual power awakens, the purity of spiritual power will be presented in several colors. White, yellow, blue, red, and purple, corresponding to inferior, medium, superior, and ultimate. However, the purity of Ningfeng's spiritual power is now presented in white, which is the lowest grade inferior. More importantly, there is a saying circulating in the practice world that if the purity of spiritual power is of poor white quality, he will never be able to improve in his lifetime, and even his spiritual power cannot be controlled. After seeing that the purity of Ningfeng's spiritual power was white, the old man sighed with regret. He did indeed see a miracle, but it was completely opposite to what he had imagined. The only thing that this old man from Xianling Hall is grateful for is that he didn't rashly say that Ningfeng's initial spiritual power was 100, and he didn't directly bring it to Xianling Hall. Otherwise, the various things Ningfeng showed behind him would make him lose face in this spiritual realm. If he angered those important figures, this child's life might not be guaranteed. The old man glanced at Ningfeng. Perhaps the child's initial spiritual power value was really high, but his spiritual root had no attributes, which means he couldn't learn any basic or higher spells on the Kaiyang continent. In addition, the purity of spiritual power was the worst, and he no longer had any hope of cultivation. Next. The old man sat back in his seat and ignored Ningfeng. Instead, he began calling for the next child to come over for the awakening ceremony, and this indifference was completely different from before. At this moment, Ningfeng's face was also very ugly. It was not because his awakened spiritual roots were poor, and he had just turned 6 years old and didn't think about the future. But because Qin Shiwen was mocking him in public, he could only be mute and sulk. This kind of thing has never happened before. Before leaving, Ningfeng gave Qin Shiwen a glare, and he took note of this grudge. Ning Yu's face was much uglier than Ningfeng's. He didn't blame his son, but took his hand and walked step by step towards the outside of the Emperor Temple. The originally quiet Emperor Temple also heard faint voices of discussion again as the two of them left. Without a word on the way, Ningfeng returned home with his father filled with anger, and then angrily took 2 bites of food before returning to the house. During this time, Ningfeng didn't say a word to anyone else, but he also ignored that no one had spoken to him either. Lying in bed, Ningfeng became increasingly angry as he thought, especially when Qin Shiwen mocked his face in the end, which made him feel uncomfortable all over like scratching his heart with 100 claws. No, I can't swallow this breath. Ning Feng grabbed a piece of clothing and ran out, aiming for the garden in the east of the city, which was what Qin Shiuan had previously referred to as territory. As expected by Ning Feng, when he arrived, Qin Shiuan happened to be here, surrounded by a group of children. At this moment, Qin Shiuan was showing off his spiritual roots. He was standing with horse steps, his hands raised, and his small face turned red. Behind him was a phantom that looked like a flying dragon. Although due to his cultivation, he could only see a silhouette, it did not prevent the other children from generously casting envious glances. After the spiritual root awakening ceremony, everyone will have some spiritual root-related knowledge in their mind, such as looking into their own spiritual domain or using spiritual power methods. At this time, Qin Shiuan was using this method to showcase his excellent spiritual roots to other children. After the presentation, Qin Shiuan wiped the sweat off his forehead and coincidentally saw Ning Feng approaching, so he sneered. "Yoha, everyone, who's here? Isn't this the young master Ning with his spiritual roots ruined?" Upon hearing this, Ning Feng glanced at Qin Shiuan and coldly replied, "What's wrong? Did I come here to bother you with continuing to defecate? Or did I bother you with eating?" Upon hearing Ning Feng's words and recalling Qin Shiuan's appearance just now, many children immediately covered their mouths and almost burst into laughter. Qin Shiuan lost again in a verbal altercation and became angry, saying, "You useless person only have a powerful mouth left." However, this time Ning Feng ignored Qin Shiuan and instead looked at the several children who were quietly hiding behind him. These children were good friends with Ning Feng and had previously been in opposition to Qin Shiuan, but now they all gathered around Qin Shiuan. "Ma Liang, Zhao Xiaoman, why are you here?" Ning Feng spoke to the few people who were hiding behind Qin Shiu's tattoo. A few children heard Ning Feng call their names and felt embarrassed to hide any longer. They walked out one by one with embarrassed faces. "Ningfeng, you're here. That's good for the Chinese New Year." For the greeting from the other party, Ning Feng tore his face and said with a straight eye, "Have you all joined Qin Fatty?" Upon hearing these words, several children lowered their heads, while Qin Shiuan, who was listening on the side, widened his eyes and angrily said, "Who do you think is fat?" Ning Feng still chose to ignore Qin Shiuan, his eyes fixed on his former companions, waiting for their answers. This also made the guilt on the faces of those children even stronger. The child named Ma Liang clenched his fists and gathered his courage for a while before saying, "Ning Feng, listen to me. I think the cultivator is also quite good. We shouldn't have been so resistant to him before. Is he good? Did you forget when he made you ride a horse? If it weren't for me, you would still be riding now." Ning Feng said heavily, but it was true. After listening, Ma Liang tightly bit his lips. He didn't know how to answer Ning Feng, but at this moment, Zhao Xiaoman took the lead and said, "Ning Feng, we don't want to either, but our parents have told us to stay away from you in the future." "Why? I don't believe it." Ning Feng questioned. He didn't believe it was true. He had always been good to these friends, and their parents also liked him very much. How could he suddenly change? Why bother asking? Of course, because you're a useless person, playing with you can get infected, and your spiritual roots will also become useless in the future. Who dares to play with you? The speaker is Qin Shiuan. He has suffered so many losses at Ning Feng's place, and he will not let go of the opportunity to humiliate Ning Feng. "You fart." Ning Feng finally couldn't help but shout loudly. Qin Shiuan became more and more enthusiastic as he spoke, "Don't you still recognize it? Your mother might have been killed by you. My mom. Oh, by the way, you don't even remember your own mother. The useless spiritual roots are really scary." End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Solo Challenge. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3 Solo Challenge. Upon hearing Qin Shouwen's words, Ning Feng's body stiffened and his face turned pale in an instant. Ning Feng's mother passed away a year ago, but what puzzled everyone was that in just 1 year, Ning Feng's memory of his mother completely disappeared. Even when he saw his mother's portrait, Ning Feng felt a bit familiar. As for his mother's life, Ning Feng only learned about it from outsiders. And his father, Ning Yuze, was even cleaner than he had forgotten. Because he had no impression of his mother, this became an unresolved knot in Ning Feng's heart. At this moment, when Qin Shouwen mentioned this matter, Ning Feng's eyes immediately turned red. He couldn't resist the impulse in his heart and screamed strangely before rushing towards Qin Shouwen. But now Qin Shouwen is like a starry moon. Ning Feng rushed towards Qin Shouwen, but neither of them made a move. The children next to him rushed forward and stopped Ning Feng. Ning Feng was originally the youngest among these children, and coupled with the fact that he was outnumbered by others, he was pressed to the ground by several older children as soon as he met. "Let go of me." Ning Feng struggled hard, but his small body was no match for so many people. After hearing Ning Feng's shout, Qin Shouwen gave him a contemptuous glance and snorted coldly, "You let go of him. I want him to be convinced." Upon hearing Qin Shouwen's words, others appeared hesitant, especially the few children who had a good relationship with Ning Feng. They are not worried that Qin Shouwen will lose. After all, Qin Shouwen has become an invincible incarnation in the hearts of these children. But precisely because of this, all children know that Ning Feng will definitely be repaired very badly. Although these children gathered around Qin Shouwen for various reasons, their childlike and kind nature made them unable to bear to see Ning Feng beaten. Qin Shouwen, seeing that everyone was hesitant to let go, urged him again, "Didn't you hear me? I want to fight him alone and make him realize that he's just a waste." The children dared not disobey the current Qin Shouwen, so they reluctantly let go of Ning Feng and retreated to both sides, leaving only Mao Yang holding on to Ning Feng tightly. "Traitor, you let go of me." Ning Feng struggled while shouting, but Mao Yang was 2 years older than him. For him at this age, the difference of 2 years was enough to be called a gap. Ning Feng couldn't even break free from Mao Yang's suppression with all his energy. "Ning Feng, you can't beat Shouwen. He can already use spiritual power." Mao Yang pressed Ning Feng and whispered to him, but he was in a fit of anger and couldn't listen. "You don't need to worry." Seeing that Ning Feng didn't understand his feelings, Mao Yang became even more anxious and continued to persuade in a suppressed voice, "Listen to me, don't fight Shouwen. As soon as I let go, you should run quickly. I'll stop him from Shouwen's side." "Mao Yang, what are you doing with your ink? Get out of here." Qin Shouwen's voice came again, and Mao Yang knew he couldn't drag on any longer. He whispered, "I let go, run quickly." After speaking, Mao Yang suddenly released Ning Feng's hands, and as Ning Feng stood up, he stumbled backwards, as if he had been knocked away by Ning Feng when he stood up. Mao Yang's goal is also very clear, which is Qin Shouwen. He plans to take advantage of this opportunity to knock down Qin Shouwen, so as to buy Ning Feng enough time to escape. Unexpectedly, Qin Shouwen saw Mao Yang fall towards him, but had no intention of caring about him. With one side of his body, he dodged and pushed his arm, pushing Mao Yang out and throwing him on the ground. On the other hand, Ning Feng did not follow Mao Yang's instructions to escape. Instead, he stood up straight and glared at Mao Yang, snorting, "Mind your own business." Upon seeing this scene, Mao Yang hurriedly and angrily hammered down to the ground, but he had done everything he could, so he sighed and retreated to the side. At this moment, Ning Feng and Qin Shouwen stood face to face, both of whom were dissatisfied and staring at each other. "Ning Feng, today I'll let you recognize how useless you are." Qin Shouwen was the first to pose a challenge, and he once again thrust his horse stance and lifted his hands into the air. At the same time, the phantom of the little flying dragon appeared again behind him. The group of children watching saw that Qin Shouwen was going to use spiritual power to attack Ning Feng. The timid ones screamed incessantly, and the slightly older children quickly spoke out to dissuade Xiuwen. Don't use spiritual power, it's too dangerous. Qin Xiuwen turned a deaf ear to these sounds and continued to mobilize his spiritual power. He intended to use his spiritual power to bully Ningfeng, who could not use spiritual power. Seeing Qin Xiuwen using spiritual power to deal with him, Ningfeng was also stunned for a moment, but then he took a step forward and lifted his leg, kicking Qin Xiuwen in the face. With this kick, Qin Xiuwen was kicked upside down and fell to the ground, and his small nose, stained with shoe prints, emitted 2 bright red warm currents. After kicking, Ningfeng frowned and asked Qin Xiuwen, "What's wrong? Are you constipated again? You. How dare you sneak attack me?" Qin Xiuwen said as he got up. He raised his hand to wipe the dirt on his face, only to see the blood stains on his sleeve. Qin Xiuwen is not yet 7 years old, and this is the first time he has seen blood in a fight in his life, and this blood is still his own. In his consciousness, bleeding is like dying. Qin Xiuwen was frightened and his eyes immediately turned red. With the excitement of his emotions, Qin Xiuwen unexpectedly gathered a spiritual power ball in an instant. Although it was only the size of a red bean, its power was already enough to cause a serious injury to an adult. "You're going to die for me," Qin Xiuwen shouted to Ningfeng with a hint of tears, while throwing the spiritual power ball in his hand towards Ningfeng. Ningfeng was still the first to see spiritual power and was immediately startled. Although he was not sure how powerful this red bean-sized spiritual power ball could be, he didn't foolishly go and get it. He quickly threw himself to the side. The spiritual ball brushed against Ningfeng's body and landed on a small tree not far away, about the size of an arm. With a click, the tree snapped in response. Seeing this scene, the cold sweat instantly wet Ningfeng's collar. Thinking that if it hit him, he would have lost his life, and Ningfeng was also instantly anxious. On the other side, Qin Xiuwen was as angry as a red-eyed bull, and as soon as he missed the first blow, he began to gather his second spiritual power. Ningfeng didn't give him a chance, and with a strong leap of his feet, he rushed towards Qin Xiuwen. Just as he pounced, Ningfeng suddenly felt as if his body had become much lighter and his arms had become stronger. At the next moment, the phantom of the outline of the flying dragon shattered after Qin Xiuwen tattooed, and Ningfeng immediately clashed with Qin Xiuwen. In theory, Qin Xiuwen is half a year older than Ningfeng, and his height is also higher. In this age group, not to mention half a year older, even 1 month older is an absolute advantage. He should steadily hold on to Ningfeng's head. Unexpectedly, what they saw was that Ningfeng had an absolute advantage, and riding on Qin Xiuwen was a fat beating to his face. How could Ningfeng be so powerful? "Yeah, I can't even finish my writing. Should we go up and pull them apart?" "Don't go, Xiuwen Lingzhen is so powerful that he definitely won't lose. Look at him, he hasn't said anything, probably trying Ningfeng's strength." "You make sense. But it seems a bit strange." The children's unabashed discussion spread to Qin Xiuwen's ears, which made him cry. He now wished someone could pull Ningfeng away, but at this moment, he couldn't even shout for help. Why is this happening? Qin Xiuwen was unclear. When Ningfeng rushed over, he felt his body suddenly become extremely weak, even struggling to open his mouth. Not only Qin Xiuwen didn't know what was going on, but Ningfeng also felt strange. Why has Qin Pengzi become so weak? Or have I become stronger? Is this the change after the awakening of the spiritual root? Ningfeng thought in his mind, but his hands were not idle. He was facing Qin Xiuwen's continuous tapping and output, and of course, he should cherish this satisfying opportunity. As for Qin Xiuwen, he could only watch helplessly as he was beaten. He was weak and couldn't even call for help, let alone resist. The reason for such a situation naturally comes from Ningfeng. No one saw a faint white halo on his body as he rushed out. After wrestling with Qin Xiuwen, Ning Feng's hand happened to pass through the spiritual root shadow that appeared behind Qin Shiuan. Then, Qin Shiuan's spiritual root shadow shattered, and the light particles transformed from the shattered spiritual root shadow also poured into Ning Feng's body. Don't say these children haven't noticed this scene. Even if there are high-level practitioners present, they will ignore it. Under the rules of this world, only after breaking through the lost realm and reaching the imperial spirit realm can the spiritual roots be completely released, which means that only strong individuals after the imperial spirit realm are likely to be harmed by external attacks on their own spiritual roots. As for the projection of the spiritual roots displayed under the imperial spirit realm, it is impossible to be touched by external attacks. This is the rule of the world, and it seems like protection for newcomers who have just entered the cultivation world, but this rule has been broken by Ning Feng. Let you show off. Let you scold me. You even fought against me alone. Ning Feng fought hard and scolded comfortably. As for the others, although they had already noticed something was wrong, no one dared to go up and pull Ning Feng apart. Even two timid female voices were already crying and shouting, killing someone, while crying loudly. This is not bad for them, it's really because the scene at this time is too scary. Qin Shiuan's face is covered in blood, and Ning Feng's hands are dyed red from the beating. The scene is like the demon in the story who slaughters creatures. Of course, these blood are just nosebleeds. At Ning Feng's age, it's not easy to hit others with manual force. In addition, the nosebleeds on one hand are slippery, so the damage is much lower, but the visual effect is indeed full. After a continuous bombardment of Qin Shiuan for half a stick of incense, Ning Feng finally stopped. After such a long attack, Ning Feng also felt his arms sore and weak, and couldn't help but gasp for breath. Qin fat man, you say you. Who can you give some color to see? Ning Feng was so tired that he couldn't catch his breath, but his mouth was not forgiving. Qin Shiuan, who was beaten, regained some strength with Ning Feng's output. After all, he didn't need to move after being beaten, which saved a lot of energy. After being beaten for half a day, Qin Shiuan naturally refused to admit it. You despicable little person. What kind of magic did you use to make me weak? Magic. It's because you're too stupid. If you don't know how to use spiritual power, don't use it recklessly. The spiritual root is powerful, so what? I'll beat you up differently. Ning Feng then raised his hand and slapped Qin Shiuan on the head. Qin Shiuan was so angry that he shouted loudly, "You're despicable." Of course, cultivators have to use spiritual power to fight each other, and you actually launched a surprise attack. Ning Feng looked at Qin Shiuan with an idiot-like expression and said, "Who said we had a duel? I just came to beat you up." End of this chapter. Chapter 4. You don't remember. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. You don't remember, you're despicable. Qin Shiuan didn't know what to say for a moment, so he had to curse first before speaking. Ning Feng didn't intend to give him time to organize his language, so he immediately asked, "Do you agree?" Not convinced. Qin Shiuan naturally refused to accept defeat, let alone feeling that his body was gradually recovering its strength. At this moment, Ning Feng let out a soft snort and stood up. Qin Shiuan was taken aback, thinking that Ning Feng was going to let him go, so he heard Ning Feng say, "Then don't regret it." "Joke, I'm afraid of you." Qin Shiuan pursed his lips and twisted his head. Although he looked more determined to die than to accept it, his heart was a bit pounding, as he always felt that Ning Feng had some conspiracy. At this moment, a little girl who was watching suddenly let out a scream. Qin Shiuan, who was originally thinking about what Ning Feng would do, suddenly felt a chill under himself. Coupled with the screams coming from beside him, he couldn't help but wonder what Ning Feng was doing. Immediately, he roared angrily and anxiously, "Ning Feng, what are you doing? You. Qin Shiuan was so anxious that he couldn't say anything, but Ning Feng calmly continued to pick up Qin Shouwen's pants and even said disdainfully, "What can you do? Spank your butt, I'll make you tough." Qin Shouen had no strength to move and could only be at the mercy of Ning Feng. Even though he felt ashamed and angry in his heart, he still struggled and refused to give up. Ningfeng didn't care what Qin Shouen thought in his heart, so he couldn't help but slap him on the buttocks. Pop! A crisp sound came out, accompanied by a voice of disdain from Ning Feng. "You give up quickly, my butt is so dirty, I really don't want to hit it." Qin Shouen did not give up as Ning Feng had imagined. He gritted his teeth tightly, but in the end, a soft sob came out, and a shy and angry tear slid down his cheek. Seeing this scene, even though others were afraid, they quickly ran over and pulled Ning Feng away. "Hee, it's so satisfying. Look at that chubby guy, dare you say my spiritual roots are useless?" After venting on Qin Shouen, Ning Feng's mood improved, but he was exhausted enough. If Qin Shouen heard this, he would be extremely angry. Is there still a place to reason with someone who is still tired from hitting someone? As soon as Ning Feng returned home, he fell asleep and didn't know if it was because he was too tired or because he fought too hard. Ning Feng had many nightmares, in which he had a different identity, but regardless of his identity, he was always accompanied by blood and slaughter. Ah, no. With a cry of surprise, Ning Feng suddenly woke up from his nightmare and saw his father Ning Yuze sitting in front of his bed. Seeing Ning Yuze, Ning Feng was immediately overjoyed. As usual, he shared his nightmare with his father and watched him comfort him with great effort. "Dad, you're back. I had a terrible nightmare just now, and I dreamt." But this time, the situation did not develop as Ning Feng had imagined, and his words were interrupted by Ning Yuze's stern voice before he could finish speaking. "Did you have a fight with Shouen this afternoon?" Ning Yuze's voice was very heavy, which made Ning Feng's heart thump and jump nervously, quickly explaining. "That's because he cursed at me, he called me, unfortunately." Ning Yuze did not have the opportunity to explain to Ning Feng and immediately pulled him off the bed, saying, "Let's go with me to the Lord's mansion to apologize to Shouen." When he heard that he was going to apologize to Qin Shouen, Ning Feng was not willing to do it. "Let go of me. I'm not going." Ning Feng shouted and struggled hard, but with his strength, how could he possibly break free from his father's hand? "Even if you don't go, you have to go." Ning Yuze let out a scolding, and at the same time, he pulled hard on his hand, causing Ning Feng to stumble forward. If it weren't for Ning Yuze still pulling his arm, he would have fallen to the ground. However, Ning Yuze did not make Ning Feng calm down as he had hoped, and the latter struggled even harder. "I'm not going. Why should I apologize to him? He scolded me first. Dad, he called me a waste." Ning Feng shouted loudly, but today Ning Yuze didn't pay any attention to him and just said to the butler beside him, "Lao Li, go prepare the car." "Yes, my boss." Old Li responded and retreated, but before leaving the door, he heard Ning Yuze say it again. "Wait a moment, go to my study first and bring that spirit-gathering pill." Upon hearing that he was going to bring the Juling Dan, Old Li hesitated and advised, "Master, Juling Dan is a precious spiritual medicine for cultivation. Taking it to the young master may help him strengthen his spiritual roots. There are also many precious medicinal herbs in our shop, so we don't need anything else to replace them." Before Lao Li could finish speaking, Ning Yuze interrupted him and said, "No need, do as I said, prepare quickly." "Yes, my boss." Old Li sighed and could only act according to orders when he saw that the persuasion was unsuccessful. Lao Li retreated from his side, while Ning Feng saw the moment when his father was distracted and bit into the hand that the other person was holding onto him. "Stinky kid. Please let go." Ning Yuze cursed, but due to pain, instinctively let go of her grip on Ning Feng. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Ning Feng crawled back to the bed, huddled in the corner of the wall, holding a pillow in his arms, his big red and swollen eyes vigilantly staring at his father. "You come over here. Ning Yuza scolded and was about to step forward to catch Ning Feng. Ning Feng was so scared that he threw his pillow at Ning Yuza and cried out, "I won't pass. He scolded me first. He even said that I killed my mother too." Upon hearing Ning Feng's words, the butler Lao Li, who had not yet walked far outside the door, also stuttered under his feet. As for Ning Yuza, his body stiffened, and the white glazed porcelain pillow hit him squarely in the face. The pillow fell and shattered on the ground, and upon closer inspection, Ning Yuza's nose was also swollen and red from the impact of Ning Feng's blow, with a nosebleed flowing out. Ning Feng smashed his father's nose all at once. He thought he would inevitably get a few slaps on his butt, but he didn't expect his father's expression to be much softer. "Your mother is not because of you," Ning Yuza said with a hint of guilt in her voice. However, before he could finish speaking, he was interrupted by a shout from Ning Feng. "Then you said how my mother died. Why didn't you tell me?" Faced with Ning Feng's questioning, Ning Yuza's body trembled for a moment, and her gaze towards Ning Feng became very complicated. Ning Yuza let out a heavy sigh, her face replaced by self-blame. "It's not that I didn't tell you, it's me. You don't remember your mother at all, do you? Why don't you remember her? You don't love her at all, that's why you don't remember, do you?" Ning Feng said more and more sadly, and his voice roared louder and louder. Upon hearing Ning Feng's words, Ning Yuza felt a sharp pain in her chest, and her eyes were filled with immense sadness. Ning Yuza stood still, feeling very tired and helpless. Ning Yuza's body was constantly trembling, and the indescribable pain made him feel suffocated. Especially a wave of sadness that came from an unknown source, making the corners of his eyes gradually moist, and tears kept swirling in his eyes. However, despite this, Ning Yuza still doesn't have the appearance of Ning Feng's mother in his mind, and he can't even remember her name. The room became particularly quiet at this moment, with only the gentle sobbing of Ning Feng and the heavy breathing of Ning Yuza. "Boss, the car and everything are ready to depart at any time." At this moment, Lao Li's voice came from outside the door. Upon hearing this, Ning Yuza took a deep breath and lifted his head. The tears in his eyes had disappeared, leaving only a stern gaze. This time, Ning Yuza didn't speak anymore. He walked straight up and, ignoring Ning Feng's shout, grabbed him and carried him on his shoulder, then strode out. Ning Feng naturally wouldn't honestly follow Ning Yuza away. He hit and bit Ning Yuza on the shoulder, but for his mischief, Ning Yuza always chose to treat him with silence. However, his hand holding his son was trembling non-stop. Along the way, Ning Feng was crying and fussing, but Ning Yuza never spoke. At this moment, he seemed a bit tired, and in his dim eyes, there seemed to be nothing but something hidden. After arriving at the Lord's mansion, Ning Yuza brought Ning Feng to compensate Qin Lin and his son, and offered the gathering spirit pill. Qin Lin did not investigate this matter and appeared very enthusiastic. He even scolded Qin Xiuwen lying in bed in front of Ning Feng for not being sensible. After two adults treated each other politely, Ning Yuza took Ning Feng home. The adults reconciled, but the two children each had a knot in their hearts. Qin Xiuwen, who was in the hospital bed, was also quite dissatisfied with his father's actions. "He hurt me, how could he just forget about it?" Regarding Qin Xiuwen's dissatisfaction, Qin Lin suddenly said harshly, "Stinky kid, please help me restrain your personality and make trouble all day. Also, remember, you can't bring up the matter of Ning Feng's mother by Lingxi again." After returning home, Ning Feng locked himself in the room alone. He curled up under the blanket, tears streaming uncontrollably. At this moment, he seemed to realize the cruelty of the world. "Just because my spiritual roots are not good, my dad doesn't hurt me anymore." Ning Feng repeated this sentence over and over again until he cried and fell asleep tired. For several consecutive days, Ning Feng stayed alone in his room. He was sad and angry, and even refused to eat. In the past, regardless of whether he was reasonable or not, he would always stop his father who had made mistakes. However, this time, he seemed to disappear and never came to see him again. Not only my father, but also the servants at home just leave their daily meals at the entrance of Ningfeng. After a few days of autism, Ningfeng lost a lot of weight again, but these days he also figured out why he ended up in such a situation. Ningfeng opened the door and, for the first time in a few days, swept away the food placed at the door. Then, he returned to the room and used his inner vision to dive into his spiritual realm, starting to study his spiritual roots. This is the reason that Ningfeng found out in a few days, Lingzhen. Ningfeng has always had a stubborn personality. Since others have left because of his poor spiritual roots, he must prove that his spiritual roots are stronger than anyone else. From this day on, besides eating and sleeping, Ningfeng spent the rest of his time studying his spiritual roots using inner vision and trying to establish connections with them. However, the cruelty of reality did not change as a result. No matter how hard Ningfeng tried, he could not feel any spiritual power, and his spiritual roots completely ignored him. A few more days later, Ningfeng suddenly realized that there were fewer and fewer servants at home. He ran to ask the butler, Lao Li, for the reason, but he always avoided discussing it. Ningfeng couldn't think of a reason, and he didn't even realize that this was just the beginning. Not long after, the original luxurious clothing and food were replaced by simple meals. Ningfeng went to find his father, but Ning Yuza was either not at home or evaded Ningfeng by saying, "I have something to do," and quickly left. On the 15th day of the first lunar month, which was supposed to be a day for family reunion, there was only Ningfeng in the vast Ning mansion, and even Old Li followed his father out. Ningfeng found half of the dry xiaobing, baked cake and griddle, left in the kitchen and returned to his bed. As he chewed the hard xiaobing, baked cake and griddle, he looked out of the window, looking forward to his father's appearance. Slowly, night fell, and the brazier inside the house had burned out, adding another layer of fear to Ningfeng, who was already hungry and cold. Finally, Ningfeng couldn't bear it and began to cry with grievances, while Qin Xiuwen's words kept echoing in his mind. "You are a waste, and being with you can also be contagious. Even my dad doesn't want me anymore." Thinking of this, Ningfeng pulled the blanket over his head and hid himself in the pitch-black bed, as if only in this way could he gain a sense of security. Auntie. Auntie, Ningfeng in the blanket kept muttering, although the child had forgotten his mother's appearance again, calling out to his mother could still provide him with a hint of spiritual comfort. At some point, Ningfeng fell asleep and the bright moonlight shone through the window onto him. The giant tree towered into the clouds, and Ningfeng stood in front of his spiritual roots. He couldn't count how many times he had come to observe his spiritual roots. Juma remained still, and Ningfeng stood in front of the tree crying loudly, "What's the use of you growing so big? Dad doesn't want me anymore, it's all your fault." End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Dizziness Want to Vomit. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5 Dizziness and Vomiting, It's All Your Fault. Ningfeng kicked and hit Lingzhen wrongfully. The next magical scene appeared, where the giant wood, which had always been like a pillar of heaven, began to shake. The lush branches and leaves began to sway wildly, and Ningfeng's spiritual realm was stirred by the giant wood, sparking a fierce storm. The inner vision method is formed by projecting the mind into the body, and should be an independent existence from the spiritual realm. In this storm, Ningfeng's body couldn't resist at all and was swept up by the storm. He was thin and weak like a leaf, and could only be ravaged by the strong wind. Young Ningfeng had never experienced such a dangerous thing before. He was too scared to stay and quickly ended his inner vision technique to escape from the spiritual realm. Unfortunately, the inner vision method had come to an end, but Ningfeng realized that he was still in his spiritual realm, and what made him even more fearful was that the feeling of being on the ground was even more real. The suffocation caused by the storm, the pain of the strong wind, and the dizziness stirred in the wind were all clearly felt by Ningfeng. He even suspected that he was in a real storm. Ningfeng was really scared, but unfortunately he is still mentally and physically, which makes it impossible for him to even close his eyes in fear, because even with his eyes closed, he can still see what is happening around him. The only thing left for Ning Feng now is to grit his teeth and bear it. At this moment, Ning Feng, who had been frightened and didn't know what to do, was suddenly attracted by the countless golden lights shining around him. Ning Feng fixed his gaze and realized that those golden lights were actually golden leaves, rolling and dancing with him in the strong wind. Ning Feng's body is still uncontrollable, but after the appearance of these golden lights, it seems that this place has become less terrifying. At this moment, a leaf quickly brushed past Ning Feng's body. Although it was only for a moment, Ning Feng was already attracted by the pattern that appeared on the leaf. That is a seed shining with 7 colors, floating in the boundless darkness. What is this? Ning Feng thought as a series of leaves swept past him, each with a pattern. These patterns gradually connected in Ning Feng's eyes, as if interpreting a story. Ning Feng's eyes gradually became blurred, and he murmured in a whimsical voice. The sky stars fall to the ground, the 8 wastelands form a garden, the root system is eternal, and the body is chaotic with yin and yang. The leaves of the myriad phenomena evolve, the mountains and seas form branches, and the stars assist. The sun and moon listen to the signs. The strong wind continued, but Ning Feng was completely immersed in the scenes portrayed by the leaves. He didn't know how long it had been, as if he had gone through eternity, or just in an instant. At this moment, a voice rang in my ear. Did you have a nightmare? Ning Feng suddenly woke up and realized that he had left the spiritual realm. At this moment, the sky was already bright, and when Ning Feng opened his eyes, he saw his father's face. His eye circles were a bit dark, and his bags were bulging high. A pair of bloodshot eyes were looking at him with concern. At this moment, a drop of freshly melted snow water from Ning Yuza's hair fell on Ning Feng's nose. Ning Feng, who was originally staring at his father in a daze, immediately turned red in the circles of his eyes. He reached out and hugged his father's neck, then burst into tears. Daddy, where did you go? You don't want me anymore. Ning Yuza felt a bit at a loss when he was suddenly hugged by Ning Feng. He didn't expect his son to be so excited. I will be obedient in the future. If you ask me to apologize, I will apologize. Don't leave me, Daddy. Ning Feng cried more and more sadly. This also added a touch of guilt to Ning Yuza's already tired face. However, Ning Yuza did not immediately comfort Ning Feng. His spoiled son showed a rare fear. How could he not seize this opportunity? Ning Yuza exerted a slight force and broke free from Ning Feng's arm, then said with a stern face, Do you really listen to me in the future? I'm obedient. Ning Feng replied without even thinking. Ning Yuza chuckled inwardly, these past few days have really scared this stinky kid. Feeling happy in her heart, Ning Yuza's expression remained unchanged. Can you get along well with Xiuwen and the others? Upon hearing Qin Xiuwen, Ning Feng hesitated for a moment. Upon seeing this, Ning Yuza's face sank and he was about to get up and leave. This frightened Ning Feng, and he quickly rushed up and hugged his father, nodding desperately, I can. I won't bully Xiuwen anymore. Ning Yuza was a bit speechless. Good guy, he didn't even know if his son didn't say anything. It turns out that Ning Feng still has this ability. However, the matter has passed, and Ning Feng has promised again. Ning Yuza has no intention of making things difficult for his son anymore, especially when Ning Feng cried just now, his heart had already softened. He only gave a symbolic instruction. Not only for writing, but also for others. You need to make sure to get along well with everyone in the future and not cause any more trouble casually. But they're going to bully me. Ning Feng looked up at his father. Ning Yuza snorted lightly, lifted her arm, and rolled up her sleeve, saying, Then Daddy will fight back with you. Seeing his father's appearance, Ning Feng burst out laughing, and Ning Yuza finally showed a smile. He raised his hand and scraped Ning Feng's small nose, then casually hugged him in his arms. The sense of estrangement that had arisen these days unconsciously dissipated into the laughter of his father and son. Just as Ning Yuza was teasing his son to burst into laughter, Ning Feng, who was leaning against his shoulder, suddenly said urgently, "Daddy, let me down. I can't do it anymore." "What's not working?" Ning Yuza was a bit puzzled upon hearing this, but he didn't let him go. Instead, he raised Ning Feng in front of him. When Ning Yuza saw her son's pale face, she was both surprised and anxious and asked, "Fenger, why is your face so white? What's going on?" "I feel dizzy and want to vomit," Ning Feng said before he could finish speaking. With a nauseous sound, although Ning Yuza avoided being hit by the center of her eyebrows, she was still forced to accept the baptism from her son. The butler, Old Li, who had just entered the door, witnessed this cruel scene and was awakened before quietly withdrawing. After the two finished washing up, Ning Yuza returned to the room with her son and dressed him while saying, "Dad is telling you serious things, you listen so well." I don't know if it was because his father took it seriously, or because he just vomited on his father's face, or because of his previous promise, Ning Feng appeared particularly honest. "I plan to send you into Taiyu Gate in 6 months' time." Upon hearing his father's words, Ning Feng's face instantly changed. He grabbed his father's arm and said urgently, "Dad, you lied to me. Didn't you say you wouldn't want me?" "I don't want to go to Taiyu Gate, I won't leave." Upon hearing her son's commotion, Ning Yuza was taken aback for a moment before explaining to Ning Feng with a smile, "Dad doesn't want you, but rather the children in our area who have awakened their spiritual roots." Speaking of which, Ning Yuza paused for a moment. He had originally intended to say, "those with excellent spiritual roots," but skipped this sentence to avoid hurting his son's heart. "Don't you want to practice? The best sect around us is the Taiyu sect." Ning Yuza still omitted a lot of things in his words. Of course, he did not let Ning Feng enter the Taiyu Gate to cultivate. In Ning Yuza's opinion, it is no longer possible for his son to continue his cultivation journey. He wants Ning Feng to become a disciple of the Taiyu sect, mainly because the Taiyu sect also has some prestige in the local area. As long as they have the identity of a disciple of the Taiyu sect, bandits from thousands of miles away will not dare to easily provoke Ning Feng. When Ning Feng takes over his own industry in the future, he can save a lot of trouble, and then he can truly rest assured to do his own thing. In these days, Ning Yuza has been away from home every day, not to distance herself from Ning Feng, but to run around and operate this matter. Her servants have been laid off, and her food has become frugal because Ning Yuza needs a lot of money to operate this matter. So, is Taiyu Gate a place of practice? I became a disciple of Taiyu Gate and became a practitioner, right? Ning Feng looked up at his father. Ning Yuza smiled and rubbed Ning Feng's head, saying, "Yes, but I've only been away for a few years now, and the days of Taiyu men's cultivation are definitely not as good as they are now. Cultivation will also be very difficult. You've been pampered since childhood and I don't know if you can persist." Unexpectedly, before Ning Yuza could finish speaking, he was interrupted by Ning Feng's excited cheers. "Dad, I can persist. Let me go." At this moment, 2 words, "excited," were written on Ning Feng's small face. Although he was still young, anyone from the Kaiyang continent knew how honorable it was to become a practitioner. Upon seeing Ning Feng's attitude undergo a 180-degree transformation, Ning Yuza couldn't help but twitch at the corner of his mouth and said in anger, "Stinky kid, you just said you didn't want to leave me. You promised faster than anyone else now." "Hee, Daddy, I'll miss you when I have time," Ning Feng said as he grabbed Ning Yuza's arm and rubbed his face against it. Although Ning Yuza had a look of his son being raised for nothing on his face, he breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. He loved Ning Feng from a young age and provided him with luxurious clothing and food. What he was most worried about was that his son would not be able to endure hardship. Now that Ning Feng readily accepts it, even if the first problem is solved, whether or not he will suffer after being sent in is a necessary test for Ning Feng's growth. As a father, even if he is reluctant, he can only watch and see. Don't rush to be happy for now. Although I have already paved the way for you, whether you can enter Taiyu Gate or not depends on you. Are you looking at me? Ning Feng stared at his father with big eyes, not understanding his meaning at all. Ning Yuza let out a heavy sigh and said, although I have already cleared some relationships, the most basic rule for entering the Taiyu Gate is still to rely on you. Ning Feng. What iron rule? Ning Yuza said, that's to say, you must be able to use the most basic spells. Otherwise, if someone accuses you, not only will you be expelled from the Taiyu Gate, but if the situation escalates, all those related to this matter will be implicated. Therefore, I demand that you learn at least one basic spell within the next 6 months. Don't worry, Dad. I will definitely learn it, and I want to learn everything. Seeing her son's confident appearance, Ning Yuza's worries did not diminish. Although Ning Feng measured his spiritual power to be very high at the time, he had a fatal flaw, which was that the purity of his spiritual power was white. Apart from being very miscellaneous, this spiritual power also had an uncontrollable problem, which is why Ning Feng's spiritual root was called a useless root. Do your best and listen to fate. Ning Yuza sighed in her heart, but with a smile on her face, she reached out to pat Ning Feng's back and said to her son, your initial spiritual power is so high, as long as you study seriously, you can definitely learn it. After hearing this, Ning Feng became even more energetic. His big eyes sparkled as he looked at Ning Yuza and said, Dad, teach me quickly. Seeing her son's high mood, Ning Yuza didn't delay and shouted to the outside, Old Li, come in. As the words fell, the butler Li walked in from outside. He bowed slightly to Ning Yuza before saying to Ning Feng, Young master, from today on, I will guide you in your cultivation. Upon hearing the butler Li's words, Ning Feng looked at Ning Yuza in confusion and said, Daddy, didn't you teach me? I'll teach you, can you learn honestly? Of course. Ning Feng straightened his small chest. Ning Yuza waved his hand and said, Forget it, I don't want to be angry with you yet. Ning Feng pouted and then tilted his head to look at the butler Li, saying, Li Bo, do you still teach others how to practice? It's not that Ning Feng suspects Li Bo, but in his impression, Li Bo has always been a diligent butler, never showing any skills. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Inspiration. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The source has no content or has errors. Chapter 7. Sealed Seeds. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7 Sealed Seeds. Nonsense, if you didn't do anything, how could Li Bo be like this? Ning Yuza couldn't believe his son's words and raised his hand to fan Ning Feng's face. Fortunately, Li Bo's voice came in time. My boss, it's my own carelessness. I don't blame the young boss. At this moment, you're still protecting him. I have to kill this villain today. Ning Yuza spoke loudly and patted Ning Feng's head, but it always gave off a feeling of thunder, rain, and small drops. But Ning Feng was so scared that he didn't pay much attention to these things. He protected his head with both hands and kept shouting incessantly. Don't, I really didn't do anything. Old Li saw that Ning Yuza was taking action, but he didn't care about his own injuries, so he stood up to dissuade Ning Yuza. Due to the loss of a large amount of spiritual power, his body was too weak. As soon as he stood up, his body shook and he fell back onto the ground. Ning Yuza didn't care about Ning Feng when she saw Old Li fall, so she ran to Old Li's side in 3 steps and 2 steps to help him. Lao Li, how are you? I'll show you. As Ning Yuza spoke, he pulled up Old Li's arm to signal his pulse for diagnosis. Seeing this, Ning Feng also ran to the other side of Old Li, supporting him while hiding his body behind him. Lao Li did not ask Ning Yuza to diagnose him. He grabbed Ning Yuza's hand and advised, Master, please calm down first and don't blame the young master. I am still in a state of confusion, how can he hurt me? Ning Yuza also knew this truth, but Old Li was injured while teaching Ning Feng. Whether it was Ning Feng's fault or not, as a father, he must first punish him. Lao Li, if it weren't for that stinky kid causing trouble, what would have happened to you? Ning Yuza asked. Ning Feng, who was hiding on the other side, also perked up his ears and listened carefully, but his body was still hiding in a position where his father couldn't directly catch him. At this point, Lao Li has already recovered some, but fortunately he was decisive just now. Apart from losing a lot of spiritual power, his body did not suffer any serious injuries. I just wanted to guide the spiritual power of the Xiaodong family to counterattack on his own, in order to help him feel his spiritual power. However, as soon as I touched his spiritual realm, an extremely powerful force appeared that sucked away my spiritual power. If my guess is correct, the Xiaodong family's spiritual root may have an extremely rare ability to absorb spiritual power. Absorbing ability. Lao Li nodded, recalling the scene just now. He still felt a heart pounding. Ning Yuza has naturally heard of this ability. Spiritual absorption has only appeared 3 times in history, and those with this ability have without exception become strong ones standing at the peak of this world. In theory, this is good news, but at this moment, Ning Yuza's eyebrows were furrowed and her face was full of solemnity. The ability to absorb spirits is too incredible, and once it comes to life, all forces on the entire Kaiyang continent will compete for it. People who have had this ability before are all struggling and pacing in the midst of bloody storms. But for Ning Yuza, all she wants is for her son to have no worries about food and clothing, live a peaceful life, and have no disasters or difficulties throughout his life. Lao Li saw that Ning Yuza had not spoken for a long time and guessed what he was thinking. He comforted him from the side and said, "Master, all of this is just my guess at the moment and needs to be verified." Ning Yuza nodded after listening, but still looked worried. As for Ning Feng, he is currently ecstatic. Rare ability. Can I become very powerful? Thinking of this, Ning Feng had long forgotten that he was still avoiding his father. Ning Feng came to Ning Yuza and grabbed his father's arm, asking, "Daddy, can I become very powerful?" "What? Do you want to become very powerful?" "Of course I do." Ning Feng replied excitedly. Upon hearing this, Ning Yuza's face darkened. Just as she was about to scold Ning Feng for abandoning this idea, she heard her son say it. "After I become very powerful, I won't forget Auntie." Upon hearing Ning Feng's words, Ning Yuza swallowed back the words that had already reached his lips. And Lao Li also placed his hand on his chest without Ning Feng and his son paying attention. After about half an hour, Lao Li's body was no longer in any serious condition. After this period of full effort to regulate his breath, his spiritual power had also been largely restored. Originally, Ning Yuza had asked Lao Li to rest first, but for the first time, Lao Li violated his orders and insisted on teaching Ning Feng while the iron was hot. Ning Yuza saw that Lao Li insisted on doing so, so he could only let him go. "Young master, did you feel your spiritual power just now?" Upon hearing Lao Li ask him, Ning Feng pouted and said with a disappointed expression, "I felt it, but it disappeared instantly, Lao Li was afraid of Ning Feng's sadness and prevented him from continuing. Although this was similar to what he had in mind, he inevitably felt a bit disappointed and couldn't help but sigh inwardly. This biggest problem is still difficult to solve. As Lao Li was worried, Ning Feng's spiritual power is the lowest grade white. Apart from being miscellaneous, the biggest problem with this spiritual power is that it cannot be controlled, which is why it is known as useless roots by the world. Taking a deep breath, Old Li kept his smile on, at least in front of his disciple. He couldn't show an embarrassed expression. "Young master, don't worry, remember what it felt like at that time, and then follow what I said to see if you can catch that feeling again. Concentrate and meditate. First use the inner vision method to go to the spiritual root, then reach out and touch it to convey your consciousness to him. Ning Feng nodded and sat cross-legged on the ground as instructed by Lao Li. He closed his eyes lightly and used the inner vision method to enter his spiritual realm. The spiritual realm remained as usual, except for the giant tree. The entire world was white. Even though a storm was stirred up inside not long ago, not a single leaf was left behind. The feeling of Ningfeng here is still as peaceful as death. Ning Feng came to the giant wood, placed his hand on it, and tried to communicate with it according to what Lao Li had said. In fact, Ning Feng has tried this method more than 100 times during these days, but this time it was taught to him by Old Li, which made Ning Feng feel like he had a few more opportunities than when he tried it himself. Time slowly passed by, but this time it was still as usual. Ling Zhen did not respond to Ning Feng, let alone show any spiritual power. Why can't I feel it? Why? Ning Feng's heart became increasingly anxious, and the confidence he had just picked up had gradually worn away. Just as Ning Feng was about to give up, he suddenly felt a slight tremble on the giant wood in his palm. Although it was only a very slight tremble, for Ning Feng, this was great good news. Did it respond to me? As soon as this idea appeared, Ning Feng realized something was wrong. Although he understood his spiritual roots, he had no connection with himself and was still an observer. At this moment, a spiritual branch wrapped in sparkling white began to extend towards the edge of the spiritual realm. What is this for? Ning Feng was slightly taken aback. Before he could understand what was going on, he heard Old Li's voice coming in. Master Xiao, I will try again to use spiritual power to help you draw out spiritual power. Can you try to connect with your own spiritual power? Upon hearing Lao Li's words, Ning Feng finally understood how his spiritual roots could move. It turned out that Lao Li was using his spiritual power to seduce it again. But isn't this very dangerous? Ning Feng thought of what Lao Li had just looked like and exclaimed anxiously, Uncle Li, quickly withdraw your spiritual power. I can't control it. Unfortunately, Ning Feng in the spiritual realm is just a spiritual projection, and no matter how loudly he cries, it cannot be transmitted to Lao Li. At this moment, the white spiritual power lingering on the branch suddenly transformed into chains, quickly drilling out of Ning Feng's spiritual realm, firmly locking the half-blue and half-red spiritual power belonging to Old Li, and quickly dragging it into Ning Feng's spiritual realm. The branch of the giant tree, upon seeing Old Li's spiritual power enter, without hesitation, plunged into it and began to quickly swallow it. That doesn't look like a tree branch, it's clearly a monster sucking on the flesh and blood of others. Seeing this scene, Ning Feng couldn't help but think about how to connect with his spiritual roots anymore. He quickly threw himself onto the branch that was devouring Old Li's spiritual power, tightly hugging it with both hands and shouting, "Don't eat anymore, you let go of Li Bo's spiritual power." Unfortunately, Ning Feng's spiritual projection is too small for the giant wood that runs through heaven and earth, even the branches are like mountains to him. Despite his hard work, he still cannot stop the speed of half-swallowing. How's Li Bo doing? He's been smoking for even longer this time than before. Ning Feng's anxious tears were about to come out. At this moment, his heart suddenly trembled and he lifted his head to look at Old Li's blue and red spiritual power, only to see the faint shadow of a black flying knife in it. Is this Li Bo's spiritual root? The spiritual root has also been sucked in. Thinking of this, a chill instantly spread throughout Ning Feng's body. He didn't know what would happen if the spiritual root was sucked away by someone else, but there was no need to know the consequences of such a thing, because it must be a very bad result. Seeing Li Bo's spiritual roots getting closer and closer, Ning Feng gritted his teeth and made a decision. Never let Li Bo's spiritual roots be sucked in. I saw Ning Feng pounce forward and choose to use his own body to block the tip of the branch to reduce the speed of absorption. However, facing the irresistible suction of the lost realm, Ning Feng's spiritual projection formed by the inner vision method is like a mosquito in the face of a storm, being sucked in just an instant. What will happen if the spiritual projection is devoured by his own spiritual roots? Ning Feng doesn't know, and no one on the entire Kaiyang continent knows either. However, there was one thing that Ning Feng succeeded in. As his spiritual projection was sucked in, the branches that absorbed spiritual power trembled slightly, and the chains formed by the white spiritual power dissipated at this moment. Lao Li's spiritual power wrapped around his spiritual roots and took this opportunity to escape from Ning Feng's body. On the other side, Ning Feng entered a strange space after being sucked into his spiritual roots. The surroundings were gray and shrouded in thick mist, making it difficult to see clearly from afar. Just when Ning Feng was at a loss, a seed appeared in front of him. He had seen it in yesterday's dream, and it was the seed that came from outside and used the world's 8 wastelands as his own nursery seed. At this moment, there were many complex symbols outside the seed that Ning Feng couldn't understand, but his intuition told him that the seed seemed to be sealed within these symbols. "Are you locked inside?" Ning Feng whispered, his hand slowly reaching towards him. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Can use spiritual power now. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8 Can use spiritual power now. Ning Feng's hand slowly reached out, and the symbols used to seal the seeds that his fingers passed by began to disappear one by one. At the moment when all the symbols disappeared, the seed suddenly emitted an incredibly dazzling light, and Ning Feng's hand also grasped it in his heart at this moment. The next second, summer rain and winter snow appeared in Ning Feng's eyes, and flowers bloomed and fell. Everything in the world transformed into a tide that flooded into Ning Feng's mind at this moment. In just an instant, Ning Feng's mind was filled with a lot of things, but he couldn't say anything special about it. Because the operation of time should be like this, there is nothing to say. At this moment, the scene in front of Ning Feng changed again. He had returned to his spiritual realm, where there was still no change, the vast white world and the towering giant wood. But at this moment, Ning Feng's face showed a mixture of surprise and joy, as he was covered with a layer of translucent white spiritual power. Is this my spiritual power? Can I use spiritual power now? As soon as I had a thought in my heart, a spiritual power surged into the sky, like a wild horse galloping joyfully. At this moment, Ning Feng became even more excited, confident that he had finally mastered spiritual power. As Ning Feng raised his arms, his vast spiritual space trembled slightly, and thousands of spiritual powers surged out of the earth, swirling in the air. "Master, I succeeded." After leaving the spiritual realm, Ning Feng planned to tell Lao Li the good news as soon as possible, but what he saw was Lao Li lying on the ground, barely breathing. Seeing this scene, Ning Feng remembered the incident where Old Li risked his life to activate his spiritual roots. Tears welled up in his eyes and he pounced on Old Li's side. "Master, are you okay? Don't scare me." Ning Feng knelt beside Lao Li, feeling helpless. He didn't know what to do and could only shout his master's name while shedding tears. Lao Li's eyelids twitched at Ning Feng's call, but this time he did not respond as usual. His spiritual roots were sucked out, causing serious damage to his spiritual realm. He was facing the danger of separation and disintegration, and it was already a miracle that he could still live. Seeing that Lao Li didn't answer him, Ning Feng became even more anxious and immediately shouted for help from his father. "Daddy, Daddy, Master, he's dying. Come on." Fortunately, Ning Yuze did not leave home. When he heard Ning Feng's call, he quickly ran over. Seeing Old Li's dying appearance, Ning Yuze's face changed greatly and she hurriedly came to Old Li's side to diagnose his pulse. Ning Feng's family runs a pharmacy, and Ning Yuze naturally understands some medical principles. Through pulse sensing, she quickly learned about Lao Li's situation. "However, I didn't know how good it was. As soon as I found out about Lao Li's current state, Ning Yuze's eyes turned red in an instant. She slapped Ning Feng and flew him out. "Rebel son! You dare to suck Lao Li's spiritual power again." This loud shout shook the entire Ning mansion. Ning Feng lay on the ground, covering his high and swollen cheeks, crying and explaining, "Dad, it wasn't me who did it, it was my master who helped me feel the spiritual power. I'm sorry, my master." Speaking of which, Ning Feng cried even harder. Although it was indeed decided by Lao Li on his own, it was only for his own benefit that he did so. At this moment, Ning Yuza can no longer afford to hold him accountable. The top priority is to save Lao Li first. He quickly took out a small bottle from his pocket and stuffed all 5 pills into Lao Li's mouth. These are 5 spiritual pills that have the effect of restoring spiritual power. Although they are not as precious as the spiritual pill given to Qin Shiwen, the value of each pill is worth a month's profit from the Ning family pharmacy. After administering the Yunling pill to Old Li, Ning Yuza was not idle either. She placed her hands on Old Li's shoulders, and at the same time, a virtual shadow of the alchemy furnace lit up behind him. This is the talent of Ning Yuza's spiritual roots, the 100-wood stove. However, Ning Yuza only has 1,000 forging realm, and the projection displayed by the 100-wood stove is relatively blurry. The only thing Ning Yuza can do at present is to use her spiritual power to open the Yunling Dan for Lao Li Hua, and combine the spiritual power of both to help Lao Li repair his spiritual realm. Otherwise, relying solely on her spiritual power will definitely not be enough. As for Ning Feng, he could only be in a hurry on the side and didn't dare to make a sound, afraid of disturbing his father. Half an hour passed quickly, but Old Li still didn't show any signs of improvement. As for Ning Yuza, he was sweating profusely and his face was pale, with a look of spiritual exhaustion. Ning Yuza gritted his teeth. He knew that if he continued like this, not only would he not be able to save Old Li, but he would also be severely injured. However, he could not give up on Old Li, not only because of their master-servant relationship of over a decade, but also because Old Li had come to such an end because of Ning Feng. Although Ning Feng doesn't understand medical theory, he has been following his father since childhood and can still see that the situation is not good. Finally, he couldn't help but ask, "Daddy, how is Master doing?" "Old Li's spiritual realm has not been fully restored yet, and my spiritual power is only enough to support one more stick of incense. Whether or not I can save Old Li depends on his fate." In Ning Yuza's voice, it was obvious that he had reached the end of his strong crossbow. The time of this incense stick was already when he was ready to fight against the damage to his spiritual realm. Upon hearing his father's words, Ning Feng's body shook and his small face turned pale. He was well aware that what a doctor referred to as seeing nature was equivalent to a death sentence. Not enough spiritual power. What to do, what to do? Suddenly, Ning Feng was stunned and clapped his hands, calling out, "Am I already able to use spiritual power?" Thinking of this, Ning Feng quickly ran to his father and said, "Daddy, I can already control my spiritual power. My spiritual power is not enough to use me." Upon hearing Ning Feng's words, Ning Yuza not only didn't show mercy, but also cursed at him, "Get out of here, don't cause trouble for me. It's only been a long time since your spiritual roots awakened. What's the point of that spiritual power? It's a bit tricky. Dad, please let me help you. Li Bo is doing this for me, and I also want to contribute." Ning Feng pleaded. Faced with Ning Feng's bitter plea, Ning Yuza still had no intention of agreeing. He didn't want Ning Feng to do his best for Old Li, but he didn't dare. Ning Yuza was well aware that her spiritual power was no longer sufficient to fill the huge gap needed for Lao Li to repair his spiritual realm, so she manipulated her spiritual power and created a spiritual vortex inside Lao Li's body to obtain some spiritual power from the outside world. This action caused Lao Li's body to be like a black hole, constantly absorbing all the spiritual power that came into contact with the outside world. The speed of absorption is definitely not something that a child who has just awakened their spiritual roots for a few days can bear. In Ning Yuza's view, as long as Ning Feng is implicated, his spiritual power will be instantly drained. Although it may not have the same situation as Lao Li, it may leave irreversible trauma. Ning Yuza knew that Lao Li had come to this end because of Ning Feng. He could also beat and scold Ning Feng, but if he wanted to use his son's future to repay this debt, Ning Yuza was determined not to do so. Ning Feng didn't know what Ning Yuza was thinking. He just kept urging, "Daddy, tell me what to do quickly. Is it okay to inject spiritual power into the master's body? Didn't you hear me? Don't get in the way." Ning Yuza snapped back to Ning Feng. Upon hearing his father's words, Ning Feng did not retreat this time, as he had already seen blood oozing from the corners of Ning Yuza's mouth as he spoke. Although Ning Feng is young, he can still understand his father struggling to heal old Li's injuries. Seeing both his father and Lao Li in danger, Ning Feng didn't care too much. He rushed forward and pressed his hands on Lao Li's chest, exerting all his strength to infuse the spiritual power he had just mastered into Lao Li's body. "Stinky kid, don't mess around." Ning Yuza was panicked when she saw that Ning Feng didn't listen to her to transmit spiritual power to Lao Li, but it was already too late to stop her. Ning Yuza immediately felt uneasy. He would rather bear the blame of being ungrateful than lift the spiritual vortex within old Li's body to prevent his son from being implicated. But just as Ning Yuza was planning to lift the spiritual vortex, she suddenly felt another wave of spiritual power surging in. Although this spiritual power is somewhat miscellaneous and far from its own purity, its quantity is so much that it is terrifying. If the spiritual power injected by Ning Yuza into Lao Li's body is a small stream, then the spiritual power injected by Ning Feng is a vast ocean. Ning Yuza was stunned. Although he knew it was Ning Feng's spiritual power, he couldn't understand why there were so many. In just 1 or 2 breaths of Ning Yuza's days, Ning Feng's spiritual power had already filled old Li's body and unexpectedly surged into his body along Ning Yuza's arm. Ning Yuza looked at Ning Feng in astonishment, but the latter seemed to have nothing to do and even had the time to lift one hand and scratch his ear. Quickly, Ning Yuza's dried-up spiritual realm had become full again. Not only that, Ning Yuza was also forced to purify these spiritual powers, otherwise the spiritual realm would be overwhelmed. Noticing this point, Ning Yuza hurriedly looked at old Li. It didn't matter at first glance, as he saw that old Li was already swollen all over. Originally weighing only 130 pounds, old Li looked at least flipped over at this moment. Startled, Ning Yuza quickly shouted at Ning Feng, "Take back some of your spiritual power. You, Li Bo, will be overwhelmed." After hearing this, Ning Feng looked at Ning Yuza with a bewildered expression on his face and said, "Daddy, how can we retract it?" Upon hearing this, Ning Yuza almost died of anger and quickly said, "You step back and don't give Li Bo spiritual power anymore." "Oh," Ning Feng responded and then retreated, while Ning Yuza, after barely digesting Ning Feng's spiritual power, began carefully refining it for old Li with her own spiritual power and gradually guiding it to repair his spiritual realm. Thanks to Ning Feng's spiritual power, although abundant, it is not pure. With the help of Ning Yuza, Lao Li finally managed to digest it. As for Lao Li's spiritual realm, it has not only been repaired, but also contains even more powerful spiritual power than before, with faint signs of breaking through. Although the spiritual realm was repaired, old Li fainted, but it had nothing to do with being drained of spiritual power before. The reason for all of this is because Ning Feng injected too much spiritual power just now, forcefully blowing it into a balloon for old Li, causing the skeleton of his whole body to shift. Later, he was corrected by Ning Yuza, and with so much effort, he was painfully unconscious. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Home blows up. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Home blows up. After settling down old Li, Ning Yuza called Ning Feng and learned the whole story from him. After listening, although he knew that it was not Ning Feng's fault, he still scolded his son, causing Ning Feng to feel depressed for a while. However, depression came and went faster, saved old Li, and I was able to use my spiritual power. These two things quickly brought my good mood back to Ning Feng. After all this turmoil, coupled with the previous anxiety and fear, Ning Feng was also tired. After returning to the house, he fell asleep and the first day of cultivation came to an end. As for the second time I started practicing, it was already 3 days later. In addition to taking care of Lao Li, Ning Yuza has been busy with the pharmacy these days. During this time, he has been completely in a state of shaking his hands and cabinets for Ning Feng's entry into the Taiyuan gate. He has been plunged into work these days. However, due to busyness, Ning Yuza forgot something crucial. Finally, Ning Feng's long-awaited path of cultivation can continue today. Old Li stood in the yard with a lively spirit. After 3 days of rest, his body had fully recovered, and even his realm had slightly improved based on a large amount of spiritual power supplementation. Ning Feng also stood in front of him with a dignified expression, his face filled with excitement, because today he can finally officially learn how to use spiritual power. Fenger, today I will teach you how to use spiritual power. Yes, adoptive father. Ning Feng replied loudly. The titles of the two have changed since that day. After hearing that Old Li was willing to help Ning Feng regardless of his own safety, Ning Yuza brought Ning Feng to Old Li's bed to worship him as his adoptive father. Old Li has been watching Ning Feng grow up since he was young, and he has always had a fondness for him. In addition, he has no children, so he is naturally very happy to accept Ning Feng as his adopted son. Therefore, without much hesitation, he gladly accepted Ning Feng. I heard before that you can deliver spiritual power to me, which proves that there is no problem with the operation. The next step is to practice the practical method. Come and learn from me. Concentrate your mind and calm your breath, transfer your spiritual power from your arms to your palms, and slowly release the intersection point condensed in your palms. While explaining, Lao Li began to demonstrate to Ning Feng. He saw his arms bent and palms relative to his chest. As the shadow of his spiritual roots appeared behind him, half blue and half red light dots slowly emerged from his palms and began to converge, quickly converging into a ball of light the size of an adult fist. Upon seeing it, Ning Feng's eyes lit up and he leaned over to Old Li, grabbing his arm and pleading eagerly, "My adoptive father, teach me how to do it." Old Li smiled and waved his palm, and the spiritual ball flew out, shattering the distant rockery. This move is so powerful. Lao Li shook his head and said, directly using spiritual power attacks is just the most basic way of attack, not considered powerful. However, this is also the foundation of all spells. You should give it a try first. Upon hearing this, Ning Feng nodded and began to gather his spiritual power in a similar manner. Ning Feng's comprehension ability is good, and soon spiritual power surged out of his palms. Unfortunately, after these spiritual powers appeared, they began to scatter in a disorderly manner, unable to gather together like Old Li, and could only end up scattered in the air. My godfather, how could my spiritual power run wild? Ning Feng looked up at Old Li. Old Li smiled slightly upon seeing this scene and walked behind Ning Feng. One hand rested on his head, while the other reached out to point his finger at the midpoint between Ning Feng's palms. With a hint of compassion, he said, "Feng, imagine a jumping channel between your hands and my fingers, and then transmit spiritual power along this channel to my fingers." After hearing this, Ning Feng nodded as if he understood something and stared intently at Lao Li's fingertips. With a goal in mind, Ning Feng's spiritual power seemed to have found its destination, with a significant improvement in accuracy. In this way, after practicing time and time again, Ning Feng finally successfully concentrated his spiritual power on Lao Li's fingertips. Although it was only the size of a soybean, it could still be considered formed. "Master, did I succeed?" Ning Feng smiled, and Lao Li also smiled with satisfaction. Although Ning Feng's spiritual power was not pure enough, he could definitely be called a genius in terms of intelligence. At this moment, Lao Li pulled out his finger, but with this withdrawal, the spiritual power gathered by Ning Feng seemed to have lost its main bone and immediately began to spread around. Ah! Don't. Ning Feng exclaimed urgently, his mind in a state of confusion, and all his spiritual power suddenly dispersed. In a hurry, Ning Feng quickly reached out to grab it, but could only grab it empty. How could that be? Ning Feng looked at the dissipated spiritual power with some disappointment. Old Li smiled kindly and said, "Fenger, although you just piled your spiritual power on my fingers, you didn't integrate them into one." After finishing speaking, Lao Li touched Ning Feng's little face and said, "You have learned very quickly. Take it slow and don't worry. Let's start from convergence and wait until you become proficient before trying to merge. I'll go prepare lunch for you." "Well, good. My adoptive father, I want to eat dumplings." Lao Li nodded and then left to prepare lunch, while Ning Feng practiced alone. Hard work pays off for those who have a heart. In Ning Feng's multiple attempts, he finally caught some tricks. In order to make it easier for these spiritual powers to converge, he constantly adjusted the direction of his hands, looking like drawing a circle in front of him. Soon, a teacup-sized spiritual power ball formed between Ning Feng's palms. "Oh my goodness! I've also succeeded myself. Let's try to merge these spiritual powers now." As soon as Ning Feng had this idea, his emotions fluctuated, and those spiritual powers swayed and dispersed. Ning Feng had to gather them again. So, an hour passed. Lao Li cooked the dumplings over there, and he came back with the steaming dumplings to ask Ning Feng to rest and eat. But when Lao Li came to the backyard to look for Ning Feng, he was as if he had been petrified and froze there. The dumplings in his hand slowly slipped down, and with the sound of the plate shattering, Old Li woke up and exclaimed in surprise, "Fenger, how did you do it?" I saw Ning Feng gritting his teeth, sweating profusely as he lifted a spiritual power ball with a diameter close to 5 meters. Upon hearing Lao Li's words, Ning Feng exclaimed urgently, "My adoptive father, my arm is so sore that I can't lift it anymore. But what should I do with this thing?" Upon hearing Ning Feng's words, Old Li couldn't help but shudder. His scalp was numb, and every hair on his body stood up. Old Li quickly shouted, "Fenger, you can hold on a little longer, don't let it down. I'll find a way." Ning Feng gritted his teeth and shouted, "Okay, I'll hold on a little longer." However, as the saying goes, Ning Feng's arms were already overwhelmed. As soon as the words fell, Ning Feng's arms softened and the huge spiritual power ball had already fallen to the ground. At the moment when the spiritual power ball touched the ground, the storm generated by the majestic spiritual power instantly swept across the entire Ning mansion. Then, a magnificent mushroom cloud rose from the Ning mansion, and the huge sound spread to every corner of the entire Lyoto city in an instant. At this moment, Ning Yuza was counting the inventory at the pharmacy on East Street. After hearing the loud noise, she and the others came to the street. When I saw the mushroom cloud rising in the distance, I chatted and laughed with others to guess what was happening, but soon someone hurriedly came to Ning Yuza. "Boss Ning, your home is gone." At this moment, Ning Yuza was looking at the scorched Ning mansion with a face full of tears and laughter. After rushing back to Ning mansion, he saw the ragged butler Li and Ning Feng with a face full of "I did this" written on his face. After inquiring about Lao Li's situation, Ning Yuza was also greatly shocked, but currently he doesn't have much time to think about it because there are more issues that he needs to handle. The vast Ning mansion has disappeared, and many surrounding areas are also affected. The only thing to be grateful for is that the location of Ning mansion was relatively remote, and there were no residents around. Therefore, although there was a lot of noise in this explosion, only 3 people were injured, and there were no worries about their lives. It would have been much simpler if no one had died. Ning Yuza only needed to spend money to smooth this out, but even so, the richest businessman in Lyoto City still became the man with the most debts in a day. After all, he had almost used all his savings to operate Ning Feng's entry into the Taiyuan gate. Fortunately, Ning Yuza is usually a good person. Although he has a lot of debts, his old colleagues are willing to work with him even if they pay a few months' salary. As for the issue of payment turnover, after Ning Yuza publicly claimed that it was due to the failure of butler Lao Li to attack the Imperial Spirit Realm, the merchants who heard this news voluntarily showed goodwill to Ning Yuza and were willing to help him provide guarantees. Even the city lord Qin Lin took the initiative to visit and even lent Ning Yuza's manpower free of charge to help repair the surrounding area and rebuild Ning Mansion. The impact of the explosion has been resolved, but another problem has caused some headaches for Ning Yuza and Lao Li, which is Ning Feng. In the evening, at the temporary residence of the Ning family, Ning Yuza called Lao Li and Ning Feng to his side. Although this matter was temporarily suppressed, anyone with a heart would still discover doubts. The vast Ning mansion was bombed out, and how could Ning Feng, who was still there at the time, be safe and sound? Moreover, if the butler Li did not have full confidence in attacking the Imperial Spirit Realm, how could he break through the realm inside the Ning mansion? So it's easy to suspect Ning Feng, because only one's own spiritual power will not cause harm to the body. I'm sorry, I didn't have a good view of Fenger, I didn't expect it to be like this. Old Li felt guilty and lowered his head, embarrassed to face Ning Yuza. Ning Yuza smiled bitterly and said, "It's not your fault for this. It was my negligence. When Feng Air was delivering spiritual power to you that day, I realized something was wrong. However, I forgot about it when I was busy later." Upon hearing this, Old Li looked at Ning Yuza with a questioning expression in his eyes. Ning Yuza rubbed her head and said, "Fenger seems to have much more spiritual power than ordinary children, but I didn't expect it to be so exaggerated." Old Li nodded thoughtfully and said, "When Feng Air awakened, his spiritual power was as high as 91. With such high spiritual power, there may not have been 1,000 people in the past of Kaiyang continent. Coupled with his ability to absorb spirits, our thinking is still too simple. With our realm, we may not be able to see its full picture." Ning Yuza also let out a heavy sigh, as this made him unsure whether he should be happy or worried. After a brief moment of silence, Ning Yuza looked at Ning Feng, who was pulling at his clothes due to nervousness, and lowered his head. Exhausted, he muttered to himself, "Feng, why is this happening?" Because Ning Yuza's voice was not loud, Ning Feng didn't hear what he was saying clearly. He thought he was asking about the family bombing, so he immediately straightened his body and answered in a dry voice, "I did it according to the method taught by my adoptive father." As soon as she spoke, there was only a pop sound. Ning Yuza clapped her desk and shouted at Ning Feng, "Nonsense, your adoptive father can teach you how to blow up our house." End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Don't want to forget again. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Don't want to forget again. Ning Feng was so scared that he lowered his head and dared not speak anymore. He had to take over the words with an embarrassed expression on his face, saying, "Master, this is my fault. Don't blame Feng for it." After finishing speaking, Lao Li squatted in front of Ning Feng and placed his hand on his shoulder. With a serious expression on his face, he asked, "Feng Air, do you tell your adoptive father how you gather so much spiritual power? Have you ever felt that your spiritual power cannot be received or your body is weak when you gather spiritual power?" This is the common voice of Lao Li and Ning Yuza, because such a huge spiritual power, not to mention Lao Li, would be difficult for even an imperial spirit realm to accumulate in one breath. Upon hearing this, Ning Feng recalled his feelings at the time and shook his head, saying, "There's no such feeling, it's just that his arms are very sore." After finishing speaking, Ning Feng rubbed his arms and said somewhat indignantly, "I'm not ready this time. I can definitely get a bigger one next time." As soon as Ning Feng spoke, Old Li and Ning Yuza spoke in unison, "Don't even think about it." Old Li, who indulged Ning Feng excessively, stopped his thoughts, but he wondered how much shadow this incident had left on him. Old Li had an immersive experience. If it weren't for the fact that Ning Feng's spiritual power was not as pure as others, just the nearly 5-meter spiritual power ball. Not to mention that Old Li had already reported to the Yenluo Hall, several miles around Ning Mansion would have been razed to the ground. Ning Feng pursed his lips and muttered, "If you don't rub it, then don't rub it. Why are you shouting so loudly?" Although he said so, Ning Feng was pondering in his heart which day he could find a place without anyone to try and see how much he could save. To be honest, Ning Feng was a little excited to be able to launch such a powerful attack. Ning Feng secretly rejoiced, and Lao Li and Ning Yuza felt a bit headache. After discussing for a while, they finally found a reason to convince themselves. The initial spiritual power of Ning Feng was very high, but the purity was poor. With the unique advantages of tree-shaped spiritual roots in restoring spiritual power, this feat was completed. Subsequently, Ning Yuza and Lao Li discussed how to block the news, and with a preliminary plan in mind, Ning Yuza summoned Ning Feng to his front. "Fenger, come here." Ning Feng stood in front of his father honestly, sighing inwardly, "What should come always comes." Ning Feng thought he was going to be scolded again, but to his surprise, Ning Yuza reached out and touched his little face, saying in a gentle voice, "Feng, although it's still a bit early for you, my dad doesn't want to influence your future. So tell me, what kind of future do you hope for?" Ning Feng didn't expect his father to say these things to him. He was stunned for a moment before answering, "I want to become particularly powerful. But this road is very difficult and long. You may get hurt, you may be sad. Even so, do you still want to practice?" Ning Yuza's words were intermittent, avoiding some things he dared not mention or even think about. Ning Feng is still young, and he may not fully understand what his father said, but he will not waver in choosing to cultivate this path. "I'm not afraid." The childish voice was incredibly firm. Upon hearing Ning Feng's answer, Ning Yuza asked again, "Is it to remember your aunt? If there are any other ways we can remember her?" Upon hearing this, Ning Feng lowered his head and said in a somewhat desolate voice, "I have already forgotten my aunt. I'm afraid I will forget my father and adoptive father again." At this moment, both Ning Yuza and Lao Li's hearts trembled, and Ning Yuza's eyes swelled. Lao Li even turned his head away. Taking a deep breath, Ning Yuza lightly patted Ning Feng's head and said softly, "Go ahead, it's time to go to bed. Your adoptive father and I have something to discuss." Ning Feng obediently left, leaving only Ning Yuza and Lao Li in the room. "Lao Li, what do you think?" Lao Li did not answer immediately, but took out a small porcelain bottle from his pocket and handed it to Ning Yuza. "Boss, do you still remember how we met?" Ning Yuza glanced at the porcelain vase, which had a golden full moon on its white background and looked like a very delicate small medicine bottle. However, he had no impression of this medicine bottle and didn't know what Lao Li meant. He first talked about the scene when he met. "Of course I remember, that year I met you while avoiding water." Old Li took the words and said, "Well, I was seriously injured at that time. It was my boss who saved me, and I stayed with the Ning family ever since." Ning Yuza nodded and didn't speak, because he knew that Old Li had not finished speaking yet. "Master, do you still remember what injury I suffered at that time? And how did you treat me?" Ning Yuza replied, "Of course I remember. It was the red feather poison, and I used it." Speaking of which, Ning Yuza was taken aback and her voice also stopped. As a pharmacy owner, he naturally knew what AQ poison was. This toxin was extracted from a rare bird called AQ, which was colorless and odorless. Initially, the poisoned person would not notice it, but the next 3 days, as the poison gradually became apparent, it would become more and more painful. Finally, the poison erupted and died before dawn on the 4th day. These are not the reasons why Ning Yuza's words were cut off. The real reason is that in order to detoxify this poison, a snake called a poison dragon must be used to extract its snake bile and refine medicine, and then combined with strong individuals above the imperial spirit realm to use spiritual power to force the poison to be released. I have never seen the poisonous dragon Ning Yuza before, let alone its medicinal cultivation. Moreover, even if I have seen it, who forced Lao Li to be poisoned at that time? He himself is only 1,000 forging realms. Thinking of this, Ning Yuza looked at Lao Li, who was also looking at him. Boss, although we don't remember, if I guess correctly, the lady who drove me away should have been Bai Lingxi, said Old Li as he brought the small medicine bottle to Ning Yuza's face. The full moon pattern on this bottle is a symbol of the ancient Bai family in southwest China. The Bai family of the ancient tribe. Ning Yuza frowned. He didn't know much about the situation of the Bai family, but since he was worthy of the word ancient tribe, his influence must not be underestimated. So what you mean is that Ning Yuza looked at Lao Li, who had already understood the other person's meaning. Lao Li nodded and said, yes, Madam may be related to the Bai family, so it is very likely that the loss of memories about Madam is also caused by the Bai family. I understand. Ning Yuza didn't let Old Li continue. He sat in front of the chair with lifeless eyes, clenching his fists tightly and loosely. It wasn't until the moonlight was clear that he said to Old Li, how do you teach Fenger? Don't send him to Taiyu Gate anymore, go to Luyun sect in 3 years. Ning Yuza finally made a decision because this matter involves the ancient tribe, and his current abilities are unable to protect Ning Feng. To ensure his safety, he must be sent to a larger sect. Time flies, and 3 years have passed in a blink of an eye. Today is the day when Luyun sect opens the mountain to recruit disciples once every 5 years. Luyun sect is considered a renowned cultivation sect in the Kaiyang continent. It is located deep in the Xingri Mountains and is also known as the Hand of Heavenly Cultivation because its location looks like a big hand from a distance. For people on the Kaiyang continent, the cultivation sects are not considered mysterious. In simple terms, they are like advanced schools of learning. People with poor spiritual roots will live in an ordinary way, going to school, working, and living an ordinary life. And those with excellent spiritual roots will participate in trials in various sections. After being selected, they can join the sect to learn cultivation methods. As for those who are not selected, most will choose secondary sects, and some will choose to return to the lives of ordinary people. As for the scattered cultivation that relies on self-cultivation, it is not without it, it is only very rare, and the reputation is not very good. As soon as dawn broke, the mountain path leading to the heavenly hand was already overcrowded. Looking around, there were not even 10,000, but 8,000. Who would have allowed the Flowing Cloud sect to open the mountain and recruit disciples only once every 5 years? Even once every 5 years, only a few dozen people can be selected to enter the Luyun sect. At the foot of the mountain, both Lao Li and Ning Yuza looked reluctant to part ways. Lao Li handed his packed luggage to Ning Feng, while Ning Yuza chattered and tidied up Ning Feng's clothes. Fenger, when you see people from the Luyun sect, be polite. Those who should be called seniors should be called seniors, and those who should be called senior brothers should be called senior brothers. Be sweet and don't cause trouble. When you test, take the initiative to say hello. Don't be nervous and follow what your adoptive father usually teaches you. Don't burden yourself, let's do our best. This series of admonitions almost made Ning Feng feel that he was not his father who acted swiftly and decisively. Although Lao Li didn't speak as much as Ning Yuza, his eyes refused to move a half of Ning Feng's body from beginning to end. Alright, I know now. You guys go back and wait for my good news. Ning Feng's heart had already flown out for 100 or 8,000 miles at this moment, and he didn't want to delay his father and the others too much. Ning Yuza couldn't bear to let her son go like this. As soon as Ning Feng lifted his leg and wanted to leave, he grabbed him back and said, "Stinky kid, don't be so restless. Have you checked everything again and brought everything with you? What is there to take with me when I go to participate in the introductory test? Once I pass, I'll talk to you. Besides, isn't my adoptive father already packed everything for me?" Ning Feng patted the bulging package with a speechless expression on his face. His father's motherly appearance today really made him a bit uncomfortable. Upon hearing his son's words, Ning Yuza realized that it was indeed the case. However, He felt uneasy no longer giving anything to Ning Feng, so he took out a stack of silver tickets from his pocket and stuffed them into Ning Feng's arms. What are you giving me money for? I'm going to practice, and I don't need this kind of mundane thing. Ning Feng looked disgusted, but Ning Yuza said with a stern expression. Stinky kid, money is universal wherever it goes, and besides, it doesn't take up space. Bring some useful things with you, be obedient. Ning Feng couldn't resist his father and could only accept it. Alright, I have to go now, otherwise when it's my turn, everyone else will be closed. Ning Feng was about to leave, but he was stopped by Ning Yuza again. Why are you in a hurry? It's still early. Let me think about what else I need to bring, don't miss it. Ning Feng saw his father start to grope around him, which frightened him. He quickly ran away and plunged into the crowd, disappearing. Ning Yuza and Lao Li looked at the long queue with reluctance, and finally exchanged a bitter smile. This stinky kid is still so noisy, I don't know if he can smoothly enter the Luoyuan sect. Don't worry, the owner. With Fenger's strength, passing the test should be no problem. Well, I don't know why I'm so uneasy in my heart. Recently, I've been feeling like letting this stinky guy join the Luoyuan sect might not be the right choice. Upon hearing Ning Yuza's words, the butler Li also let out a long sigh and said, Master, if you care, it will be chaotic. It seems like you don't care. After speaking, Ning Yuza looked into the distance and gave a bitter smile, saying, It's good to go, otherwise Liutu City will be ruined. End of this chapter.